What's up, Packer fans? Welcome into the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. My voice still recovering from the Bucs game. Hopefully, it goes back to normal soon, but thanks for bearing with me in the meantime. We've got a ton to get to. It was a very busy news day. Most of it not great news, but a very busy news day in the Packers sphere. So let's kick things off right away with the main story, and that is the fact that Davante Adams and the Packers have broken off contract negotiations, and per Ian Rappaport, things are not in a good place. So that could mean a variety of different things. Davante Adams and the Packers not being in a good place contractually isn't that abnormal of a thing, right? Contract negotiations can go in a variety of different ways, and just because they're far off in contract terms doesn't necessarily mean that this isn't something that gets resolved eventually, right? We've seen contract negotiations go back and forth, be called off, then get back together. Like, that's not a super uncommon thing. Now, if Davante Adams and the Green Bay Packers relationship is in a bad place, that's something entirely different, which we'll get to more in just a little bit. So it was initially reported by Ian Rappaport, eventually confirmed by the Athletics' Matt Schneidman. So this definitely is something that is happening at the moment, and it's going to be kind of a wait and see as to how this affects the Packers, Davante Adams, etc., kind of moving forward through the rest of this training camp and offseason. So let's start here with how we kind of got to this point a little bit, because Davante Adams was, by all accounts, expected to be sort of the first and easiest thing that got done this offseason. So rewind to the beginning of the offseason. Everyone knew that Davante Adams was due for a new contract, and everyone knew that, the Packers loved Adams. He's one of the best wide receivers in football, and there were very few ways for the Packers to actually save money in 2020, to maybe sign some of their own free agents, to maybe sign some additional free agents from the outside. One of the few ways that was out there that seemed to make the most sense was to give Davante Adams a huge extension, backload a ton of that money, pay him almost nothing this upcoming season so that you can save on this season, and it kind of is a best of both worlds. It was expected to almost be like the low-hanging fruit of this offseason. In fact, if I would have been betting ahead of time of what deal got done first, I probably would have expected Davante Adams to potentially be one of the ones on the top of this list that got done once the offseason actually started. And the fact that it just kind of dragged along and dragged along and dragged along and nothing ever got accomplished certainly was a red flag, especially as all the Rodgers stuff was going on. And while everyone was understandably blasting the Rodgers content and going over Rodgers, it was interesting to me, and I actually mentioned this before on this show, it was interesting to me that nobody was talking about Adams, because his contract not getting done was quietly a fairly big red flag, because again, we all expected that was going to be one of the easiest contracts to get done, and the fact that they did their entire offseason without touching Davante Adams screamed to me, all right, this doesn't look great. And that doesn't mean that something can't get done. It doesn't mean that something won't get done. But again, the fact that we hear today that negotiations are no longer being done, that both sides broke it off and that it's not in a good place, that's obviously not what you want to hear as a Packer fan with your number one wide receiver in the NFL and a player that's truly special and has been a great Packer. Again, it's just not something that you want to hear, right? But we'll get to more of that in just a moment. The next big question, of course, is will Davante Adams show up to training camp? Now, if you remember, he was asked during mini camps and OTAs if he would show up to camp without a new deal, and his answer was yes. He said, basically unequivocally that he would show up even if he didn't have a new deal done. Now, this new news of the Packers and Adams are not in a good place, does that change that? And again, there's a difference between the two sides being in a bad place, like personally, and just, the agent and the team are far apart on contract structure, right? Those are two totally different things. And as far as I've seen, we don't know the full extent of exactly what that means. If I were a betting man, and again, I would have lost the bet earlier, but if I were a betting man, I would say that I expect Davante Adams to show up to training camp. But at this point, with the way this offseason has gone, basically nothing would surprise me at this point. But what I really want to go over today, and I mentioned this on Twitter earlier today as well, is that there's a lot of reasons why this contract is incredibly, incredibly difficult to get done. So let's start with Davante Adams and his agent and their side of things, right? First and foremost, there's little question that if you're Davante Adams or his agent, that you want to be paid as the best wide receiver in football. He's just been voted a first-team All-Pro. By all accounts, he has been rated by his peers and the experts and everyone that wants to talk about it as the number one wide receiver in football. As Packer fans, we've been talking about it, right? That Adams is the best wide receiver in football. So if you're Davante Adams, you want to be paid as such. And if they paid David Bakhtiari to be the best left tackle in football, Aaron Rodgers to be the highest paid quarterback in football, if I'm Davante Adams and I'm the best wide receiver in football, I sure as heck want to be paid as the best wide receiver in football. I think that only makes sense. So on Davante Adams' side, that's what I would certainly be negotiating for. Also, from Davante Adams' side of things, and he kind of made mention to this previously this offseason, is there's a chance that he wants to see how this Aaron Rodgers thing plays out. If all of a sudden Rodgers doesn't come back or there's a big fallout between Rodgers and the organization, like Rodgers is his guy. Like those two are very close by all accounts. And if he feels like the Packers were not fair to Aaron Rodgers and Rodgers is still, ticked off at the Packers and Adams and Rodgers are still very, very close, Rodgers might say, you know what? I'm happy to play out this season and we can figure out something next season and I'll probably end up wanting to sign with another team. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm saying that could be the case, right? It wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility at all. He wants to see how this Rodgers situation plays out. And if it doesn't go well, he might say, yeah, I would, ideally like to go somewhere after this season. That's not out of the realm of possibility. Davante and his agent also understand that he's not getting any younger. So he's going to be 28 and then he'll turn 29 this season in December. So he'll finish up this contract at age 29. Next season, when a new contract kicks off, that season he will be 30 in December of that season. So he's starting basically that contract in his 30-year-old age season. That, of course, is like the big taboo number in the NFL is like when you turn 30, unless you're a quarterback or a kicker, maybe a punter, like once you turn 30, like things, you're not giving out massive contracts to players anymore. So Davante Adams realizes that this is his last opportunity to really cash in. Like if he signs a 4-year deal, like, on top of what he's on this year right now, like that's going to take him into his 34-year-old season, like as a 34-year-old. Like he's not getting another big contract after that. Like it just doesn't happen that way. So like this is his last opportunity to really cash in. So he really wants to cash in. Also, Davante Adams' last contract ended up being fairly team friendly. So he kind of wants to make up as well for him overachieving in his last contract. So that's another factor where if you're Adams and his agent, you're going to say, you know what? We made way less in our last contract than what we provided to the team. We want to make up for some of that now. We want a huge payday. We want to be the top paid wide receiver. And then the other big thing at play here for Davante is, of course, I'm sure he would love to avoid the franchise tag. We just talked about the fact that this is Adams' last big payday. Well, if he plays out this season, franchise tag next season, the Packers could franchise tag him another season after that. I don't think either of those things are likely based on the Packers' finances and trajectory, but theoretically, if you're Adams and his agent, that could happen. Now you're the time where you're on the free agent market is when you're 31 years old and your contract is going to go significantly down. 32 years old. So your contract's going to go significantly down when you're up there in age. You're not going to get that big payday at that point. Now you got two big franchise tags, probably about almost 50 million for those 2 seasons, 45-ish, 50 million for those 2 seasons. But you didn't get that long-term huge payday that you were hoping for. And if something happens this year or next year and you have a major injury, that franchise tag did you a massive disservice. So they want to avoid that as well. So from an Adams standpoint, yeah, he wants to get paid. He wants to avoid the franchise tag. He wants to be paid the best wide receiver in football. And he wants to get that huge payday because this is his last opportunity to do so. That's what's driving Davante Adams and his agent at this point. And all of that makes sense. If I were Adams or his agent, I would be asking for all of those exact same things. No questions asked. If you're the Green Bay Packers, you can see it from a totally different side. The first and biggest issue is Adams wants to be the highest paid wide receiver, but what does that mean exactly? DeAndre Hopkins' most recent contract with the Cardinals screwed everything up for the wide receiver market. He signed a 2-year extension worth $54.5 million. So every wide receiver agent is going to say the highest paid wide receiver in football is DeAndre Hopkins at over $27 million per season. All right. Julio Jones, number 2 on that list, was a $22 million per year extension. And I guarantee you, like, you just don't see a jump from like the number 2 guy being 22 million to the number 1 guy being $5+ million more per year. Like, that is insane and completely unheard of. So I guarantee you Green Bay wants to negotiate at more around that Julio Jones contract and say, listen, what Arizona did with DeAndre Hopkins is lunacy. Like, that's not normal. That's not what happens. Just because the Cardinals were insanely stupid to do that deal and raise the bar that high does not mean that we're going to do the same thing. And also remember, the Cardinals were in a weird spot because they just traded for Hopkins, so they needed to give him a huge deal. Also, more importantly, is that Hopkins contract was an extension on an existing deal. And if you add the years together, the 2 years that he added on for the $54 million plus his current deal, and you spread it out over the 4 or 5 seasons, it is much, much less. It's closer to about $20 million per season. So it's way less than that 27 per million mark. So you know the Packers are going to want to say, listen, you want to be the highest paid receiver in football, that's fine. But in reality, that's more like Julio Jones at 22 million, not DeAndre Hopkins at 27 million. And we're not talking a 5 million difference here, right? We're not talking 27 million to 22 million in just 1 year. We're not talking just like a $5 million. We're talking over maybe 5 years. Like, that could be the difference between 20, 25 million, depending on the length of that deal. That is a significant amount of money in the NFL today. So there's a potentially huge divide there. And I would be on the Packers side on this one, as much as I just was on Davante's side saying I'd want all those things. If I'm the Packers, I am not saying we're not going to pay you more than the 27+ million per year that Hopkins got, because that was, again, an extension, a 2-year extension on an existing deal. And it was completely out of left field for Arizona to give him that much money. So in good faith, I would say it's not going to be that much. It was a weird contract that Arizona gave to Hopkins. As if I'm looking at it from a Packers standpoint, Adams' age works against him as well. We just talked about the fact that his next contract starts at age 30. If this is a year's thing, if I'm the Packers, I'd probably prefer maybe like a 3-year extension. Maybe I'm willing to go 4. If I'm Adams, I probably want 5. I probably want 5 years on top of what I have right now. I want to retire a Packer. I want to get paid through all of those seasons. And we all know that like the last year of the deal, it like never ends up really happening anyway. So I want 5 years. Packers are probably saying I'd want 3 or 4 years. And you can point to the decreases in wide receiver play as they get older and older. And the Packers are probably going to go back to his agents and say, listen, like we're not going to pay you for what you did in the past. We're going to pay you for what you're going to do in the future. And in all likelihood, you're not going to have 5 years of play like you did this last season, where his numbers were better than they ever were in any season ever before. So again, I can kind of see Green Bay's way of looking at it there as well. The Rodgers situation also plays a major factor in this from the Packers side of things. We just said Davante Adams probably wants to see how this plays out. There's a good chance the Packers want to see how this plays out. If Aaron Rodgers isn't back and Davante Adams is saying, hey, I would either want to go somewhere else, or like I want this huge long-term deal, or whatever. If Rodgers is gone, you could easily say that like a rebuild needs to happen sooner rather than later. Like, you need to kind of go take a couple steps back before you can take a couple steps forward, especially with the salary cap situation that they're in. If Rodgers is back and they sign him to a big extension and, give him a ton of money to stay, you can make an argument that the all-in window is like now 2 or 3 years with Rodgers, and you'd want to see Davante Adams there for that as well. So you're going to mortgage a ton more from the future for this next 2 to 3 year window to try to make another run with Rodgers and Adams and Bakhtiari and Alexander and Clark, etc. And that's what you would do. But if Rodgers is gone, you're much more likely to say, we're going to go in a different direction. We need to get younger. We need more prospects. We need to, give ourselves some insurance in case Jordan Love doesn't work out. Like, you go in a totally different direction. So Rodgers gone, you might say, I don't want to give Adams a 5-year massive deal if Rodgers is gone. It just doesn't make the most sense at that time. And if Rodgers is there, you might say, you know what, Rodgers there, we want Adams there as well. Those two have a ridiculous connection. Bringing back Rodgers and this whole team, but then saying goodbye to Adams doesn't make a ton of sense. So I guess we're even all in even more. We're going to bring both of these guys back for, 4 or 5 seasons, whatever it is, and try to open that window up for as long as we possibly can. So that Rodgers situation plays a part from a Packers standpoint as well. Packers standpoint, the franchise tag, exact opposite, right? They might say, listen, we're going to give you more towards that Julio Jones deal right now. If you don't take it, we're going to franchise you next year, and it's only going to be around $20 million. And then we'll franchise you the year after that, and we're still going to end up better off for it, and we can go in that direction instead. So they can threaten Davante and say, hey, you may want to take this long 4-year, 22 per, 4-year $88 million deal now because, excuse me, you may not see that if we just franchise you the next 2 seasons. So the Packers kind of have that weapon at their disposal as well. Also, there's the fact that the Packers have played well without Davante Adams, 6-0 in the last 2 seasons, and the offense continued to put up points. And even though Adams has played at least 12 games in every season of his career, he's played in all 16 games only twice. So it's not like he's been, even in his prime, a picture of consistency and health. So now you're going to ask yourself, how does ages 31, 32, 33 with 17 game seasons and all this wear and tear from all the postseason games, excuse me again, and things like that, how does that play into all of this? So these are all things from a Packers standpoint that you're asking of Davante Adams and his agent. And again, the hope here is that you find a common middle ground, but you can also see why these two sides are apart. And again, the Aaron Rodgers situation plays a huge part in this. The age plays a huge part. Money plays a huge part. And because of that, I can see why, you might be $4 or $5 million in that ridiculous DeAndre Hopkins contract. You can see why they might be around $4 to $5 million apart per season on a potential deal, which over, again, 5 years is a significant amount of money. And somehow they're going to have to find a way to close that gap. So again, the biggest question I have here is this just negotiation stuff or is this personal? And I think we'll find out more with, how does Adams at camp this week? Usually if he's at camp, he talks to the media. Usually he's pretty level-headed about stuff and just honestly phenomenal about stuff. So we'll definitely learn more in the next couple weeks here with Adams. But remember when I talked on my Shatter Points episode of, the last thing you want with this Rodgers situation is it to start poisoning other areas of the locker room. And I'm not saying this is happening here, right? I'm nowhere near ready to jump to that conclusion. But if all of a sudden, Adams isn't happy because Rodgers isn't happy, and then other people start asking questions, and then it just starts to spread around the locker room, that divide can go from management to players. That starts getting even wider. Things could get really bad really fast. So I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm just saying that, this is the point where if Rodgers and Adams are both upset with the organization, some major missteps have been made, and Green Bay has a lot of work to potentially dig out of that hole, not only for this season, but for seasons to come as well. Oh, by the way, lots of other news as well. Amari Rodgers finalizes his contract, so the Packers have their entire rookie class signed prior to the start of training camp. Isaiah McDuffie, Packers rookie linebacker, goes on the non-football injury list, so that'll be something worth monitoring when he gets in. How long is he out for, and what does that mean for his season? Josiah DeGuara was placed on the PUP list, so that's another injury. That was always expected, so not necessarily huge news there, but it was officially announced. Aaron Rodgers was shown in a picture working out with David Bakhtiari, so maybe a good sign. Bill Huber reports that it seems like Vegas is putting their money on the fact that Aaron Rodgers will not be a Packer this upcoming season, which Vegas tends to have a lot of money riding on these things and more often than not tends to be right. Who knows? Not a great sign, but you love to see the fact that Rodgers is working out with Bakhtiari, and hopefully that leads to those two coming to camp early next week. Only time will tell. It is crazy time right now for Packer fans, and buckle in. It's going to probably be a wild ride this next week or so to see what all happens, but I'll be right here to cover it all. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it as always, but until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.